Long to go.
Well, for more on this now, I'm joined by Liberal Senator David Fawcett. He is the chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, and back in 2015 was leading an inquiry, committee inquiry that did lead to recommendations along the lines of what the government's announced today. David Fawcett, thanks for your time. So what did you actually recommend back in 2015?
Well, back in 2015, we looked at what the Australian military needed for its own defence needs in terms of equipment. And what we realised was that the government procurement wasn't often enough or big enough to actually sustain our industry base. Therefore, we had to develop exports in certain areas to sustain the industry base that we need.
So this is an interesting point. If we take the flip side here and don't do anything, are you saying we're going to lose further capability and capacity in our own defence industry?
Correct.
So we're going to lose the ability to make the radars, the Bushmasters, the other technology that we currently do?
So, for example, the radar that's in the Anzac frigate and that will be going into the future frigate is an Australian-designed radar. It's better than anything any other country, including the US, has. So that kind of leading-edge technology we wouldn't have, and potentially our allies wouldn't have, if we didn't have a defence industry base here.
All right, but do we need to be one of the top 10 defence exporters in the world to sustain our industry here? Do we need to go that far?
It's a target. You know, the report said if we want to retain industry, get rid of the peaks and bumps and actually make them viable, then they need to export. We're not going to support every industry that wants to export anything, but the policy, both the defence industry policy and the export policy, identify a defence industry capability plan, and where those capabilities are important to our sovereign defence capability, we will invest to help those people export so they are sustainable.
Now, when it comes to how this will actually work, $3.8 billion in a loans facility, what happens if a defence contractor, a defence business, small or large, puts a plan on the table? How is the assessment made, as you understand it, as to whether that will get the money or not?
Well, look, currently some companies, so Codan is a good example in South Australia, they export defence-related products to a range of people, including the United Nations, and mostly do that without any support. But there are some areas, for example, Burden, a company who produced boats to support the erection of combat bridges. They've supplied some 370 odd for the US Army. They weren't able to actually satisfy the requirements for the contract without funding because of the risks that banks see, not in terms of the product, but in terms of the process of government-to-government type sales. EFIC plays an important role because it can provide that certainty.
So a firm might want to bid for a US military contract. They don't have the scale to deliver it at the moment.
Correct.
But if they were to get that contract, they would need to show, you know, we've got the money behind us.
Which is exactly the same thing we apply in our procurement process. We look at someone and say, does David Speers and his company, have they been around for a while? Are they robust? Will they be there in 5 years' time? If the answer is no, we probably won't buy from you, no matter how good your product is. So one of the things we're doing is helping these people present a package to a foreign customer that makes them attractive.
What do you say to the criticism from the Greens, from human rights groups, that we're only adding to the global arms race here?
Look, as recently as June of 2014, we signed the Arms Trade Treaty, which specifically looks at who you can and can't sell. Articles 6 and 7 look specifically at things like human rights abuses, and where there are concerns about the receiving country, then we are obligated to refuse the application to export those arms. So we have tight controls already, and we are part of a global framework that has, as recently as 2014, become even tighter.
But will Australian defence equipment end up in the hands of some countries that perhaps shouldn't, you know, through a third party?
Look, there are end-user agreements, and particularly anything that comes out of the States with the ITAR's requirements, but you see it coming out of Europe as well, where you have to basically give undertakings in terms of the tracking of that equipment and who the end user is going to be.
Can I turn to another matter? Tomorrow you're part of the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence and Security, which is looking into the government's announced foreign interference laws. So this will be the first, it is the first, isn't it? The first inquiry that,
Yes.
public and private inquiry that you're holding into this. What are you hoping to establish as you go through this process?
Look, I'm not going to talk in detail about what the committee is doing, but clearly the government's intent is to make sure that we have in place legislation that limits where appropriate, but certainly identifies and makes transparent any attempt by a foreign power or sovereign or principal, I think is the word used, to influence outcomes in Australia. And I think the Australian public would expect no less from their government.
All right, Senator, and I should have mentioned in the introduction, former Lieutenant Colonel in the Army. As a pilot, of course, David Fawcett, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Dave.